Central concepts. Okay, so this is the PowerPoint that Cathy created, and I have been studying feverishly this morning, but I think I'm on top of it. And as I said, we did create the ideas for this together. So let me say a little bit about some of the core concepts. So young voters have done an enormous amount of politics online. So our network actually started before the 2008 election, but obviously, as all of you know, the role of youth and the role of digital media in the 2008 election received a great deal of attention because it ended up people feeling it was quite politically significant. But there were other events as well. The Arab Spring, which I think happened the second year of our research network, sort of highlighted the significant role of digital media, or at least a potentially significant role in social change. You can take a look at Occupy Wall Street, obviously Black Lives Matter. These are all movements, and we could talk about the Dreamers, we could talk about any number of social movements, especially those involving young people that have had a huge dimension of them carried out online. Despite all of this, or I shouldn't even say despite, because it may be well-founded, there's a good bit of skepticism, and I know in the halls of APSA, skepticism is, encouraged or part of the culture or something like that. But which is fine, and I think there are a lot of political scientists who have not necessarily endorsed, and perhaps shouldn't, the idea that digital media is really that big or important a thing, or do we really understand why it's important? So I think what Cathy wanted to do here was just highlight a little bit about this. A number of the major and important studies to come out early have highlighted reasons to ask questions about whether all of this, what does all of this activity add up to? And are there ways in which, for example, digital media might be a distraction? Or are there ways in which it might shift, literally where you read the news, but you'd still be reading the news? Is it really a getting richer kind of storyline where those folks who already had big voices now have access to and ways to mobilize people through a new set of mechanisms, but you have roughly the same dynamics. Here's some quotes. This is from a very interesting study that Schlossman, Verba, and Brady did in collaboration with the Pew Internet and American Life Survey Project that many of you may be familiar with. But if we began this inquiry hopeful that the political possibilities of the internet might disrupt long-standing patterns of inequality in American politics, what we found by and large has shown those expectations to be unfounded. If the internet is bringing new people into politics, is it bringing new kinds of people into politics? And even if the internet is effective in generating political participation, what are the implications of internet-based political activity for democratic equality? And I think we share with Verba, Schlossman, and Brady, or Schlossman, Verba, and Brady in this case, a real interest in this question of political equality and whether or not there are ways in which young people's use of digital media may be consequential, not just in terms of how people practice politics, but whether it changes at all the nature of political voice and influence. There's a great deal we could say conceptually about all of this, so I'll just highlight a little bit, but if folks have questions or comments, we can talk in more detail about all of this. A good bit of the work that's been done in political science looking at digital media and the internet is focused on institutional politics. Some scholars, and we cite a number of them here, have focused on the expressive domain of politics. And I think our focus, and you'll notice when you look in the code book at the items on the survey, is we certainly have items that speak to institutional politics and to expressive politics, but we're interested primarily in this notion of participatory politics. So let me say a little bit about that. The network came to believe that the norms and cultural practices of young people are shifting in a digital world, and that this shapes where and how they engage politically. Much of this work was influenced by Henry Jenkins' notion of participatory culture. And Henry has been a member of the network and is a scholar in communications who argues really about a much broader shift just than in the political domain, but around the degree to which we, in many domains, are seeing the ascendancy of a participatory culture, a culture with relatively low barriers to entry, a great deal of artistic expression, strong support for creating and sharing content, informal mentorship, where people with experience pass along knowledge, but it is not by and large, where it is different is many of the sort of hierarchical relationships that often exist, or the ways in which, for example, news and information and entertainment was very frequently understood to be a sort of one-way street where it was just broadcast out to, the audience, has changed dramatically, where the audience become meaningful participants, co-creators, remixers, and fully engaged in the culture in those ways. And what we've really been thinking about a lot, and what the survey is trying to do, is give us ways to think about the degree to which much of that change is showing up in political practice. So let me say a little bit about that. Before I get to political practice, let me highlight two domains that we look at when we're talking about participatory culture. One is friendship-driven activities, which is interacting with family and friends. Often there's no relationship to politics, and you'll see on the survey, especially the wave 2, more than wave 1, a good number of items that speak to the ways in which young people engage in what we call friendship-driven activities. You can think of what a lot of people do on Facebook or Instagram and the like as friendship-driven. We contrast that with interest-driven activities, which obviously people engage with their interests, often with their friends. And when people are doing friendship-driven activities, they may be talking about their interests. But and this builds on work that Mimi Ito and her colleagues did in a massive anthropological study where they studied young people's engagement online, that there are a good number of ways in which people engage where the primary focus is their interests, not their friends. And so they're frequently engaged with people they may not know personally or know in a face-to-face way. But the reason that they're in that community or a part of that online experience is because all those people share an interest, which could be in fishing, and it could be in cars, and it could be in a given entertainer, it could be in fan fiction, it could be in a craft, it could be, in other words, in a lot of different things that are of interest to them, but that's why they're engaging in that way, that's why they're a part of that community, and that is noticeably different than when people are engaging with their friends online or a part of a friendship-driven community, and that distinction ended up being very important in their anthropological work, and part of what we wanted to understand was what were the relationships between those kinds of engagements and the political domain. Certainly, interest-driven activities could be about politics, and on the survey, we ask about that some as well, so that people can distinguish between whether the interest is, at least largely non-political, or whether or not it's political in its focus. So here are just a number of some of the sort of organizing assumptions that Henry Jenkins and others highlight when talking about a participatory culture. That they're used to sharing and being in contact daily or hourly, that there is an expectation that people would participate, so that now, for example, which certainly wasn't true when, you would launch a movie, certainly when I was young, there was not generally a large participatory dimension to the launch of a movie, whereas now there is. And so that's a major change in the way in which culture is practiced. But it's also true, and this has always been true in many respects, that the lines are blurry between popular culture and politics, and digital media plays a key role in helping to blur those lines. All of this contributes to participatory politics, and here's how we define this notion of participatory politics: that it's interactive, that it's largely peer-based. So we're very interested in politics that is about the networks of peers or people in a community together, not guided by deference to elites and not run by formal institutions, which doesn't mean that these peers don't interact with formal institutions. It just means they aren't sort of taking orders from those institutions, and that it's meant to address issues of public concern. So these are some of the items that are on the survey that speak to participatory politics. You know, did you create a video online, circulate a political blog, join a political group, retweet, you know, someone else's article or blog, et cetera, et cetera. And again, all of these are in the code book. And I think, David, am I right? We can share even these slides if that's helpful to people. Yeah, so, but these items, as I said, are all in the code book. And in the papers as they come out, we of course describe them, but all of you can do this. And I should say, we don't have a lockdown, you must define participatory politics this way. People will decide, because of the ways they're conceptualizing the relationships they want to look at, how they want to do that. And that's participatory, that's as it should be. We think some of the tools that are really key here are knowledge, skills, and networks, which of course relates in important ways to a kind of social capital framework, and indeed in the first sort of significant publication that Cathy and I did off the survey, you know, we talk about this notion of sort of digital social capital and the like. And we think that it's important because it enables people to mobilize latent publics, networks of friends, families, and acquaintances, which is, of course, always relevant in political activity. But we think there are ways in which the affordances of new media make this even more possible. So here are just a couple fun examples. What would Dumbledore do? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Harry Potter Alliance, but this is one of the organizations that folks in the network studied, because the Harry Potter Alliance has sort of tried to figure out what Dumbledore would do to sort of work to make the world a better place, and mobilized people's connection to Harry Potter in the service of doing that. And if you go on the website, you can read reports about it, but it sort of is emblematic of one of the ways in which we see this blurring of culture and politics. Black Twitter is obviously a whole constellation of activities and dynamics that are super important in trying to think about ways in which African Americans are mobilizing to bring about change. Here was an example that, you know, Cathy wanted to highlight, the If They Gun Me Down campaign, which is I think, very, again, emblematic of some of the dynamics we think are so important about what becomes possible in a digital world. So I think folks, many of you probably know the rough outlines of this story, perhaps far better than I do, but the basics are, right, that after, this was after Trayvon Martin, what? Oh, it was Michael Brown, right. It was after Michael Brown was killed, and they put up, do we have the picture? Yes, in the center, the picture that the news media initially reported. And then they reported that rather than the picture next to it, a much more sympathetic photo of Michael Brown. A number of people began, you know, saying, you know, if they gun me down, which picture of me would they use? And this was an exam, and this, Cathy would probably know the numbers. I don't know the numbers offhand of the number of people who posted it, but it was certainly in the thousands. It gained national attention, and it changed the way editorial boards thought about and forced them to be more attentive to the kinds of images they were using in their process for determining that. in a way. So again, it's not that participatory politics isn't connected to an important institution or to major organizations like, leading newspapers, TV stations, and the like. It's that there was no central organization. This wasn't the NAACP decided we have to do something about the way Michael Brown is being portrayed in the media. This was people creating or tapping into the affordances of new media to put pressure on institutions to behave better, right, to change their practices. So some of the benefits. You can circumvent some gatekeepers, right? I mean, I think we see this a lot in digital media. Indeed, politicians frequently circumvent gatekeepers. Obviously, politicians on Twitter is an example of this. It's much different than holding a press conference, which used to be much more the norm. You can customize materials and information. You can get greater reach, through networks. In ways, especially if we think about why is this so valuable for young people, if young people have access to networks that they wouldn't, and to disseminating their ideas and their perspectives, or to sharing what they are interested in with their networks in ways that are far more efficient and powerful than most young people would have ever had access to before. And there are lots of ways in which participatory politics can push the boundaries of popular culture. And the example of Oscars So White as one, again, very emblematic example of the way in which culture and political action, as well as we might think, and certainly in the Participatory Politics Research Network, we do think that it's important not just to understand politics as activities connected to the state. So while we think those are very important, we think obviously, political act, we would characterize as political action to, for example, change the way in which, the people running the Oscars are the degree to which they're conscious of, for example, issues of race. Downside, I think there are questions about these weak ties and what they ultimately lead to. Certainly, we're all aware of dynamics related to things like echo chambers that can be quite prevalent for young people as well as for adults. There are concerns about whether this engagement is superficial, and when Jen shares a little bit about her work on flash activism, I think she would push back on many of those notions, but that's certainly one of the major concerns. There's a concern that it might replace real politics, real in quotes, but that people will think, well, if I do Oscars So White, I don't have to vote, or vice versa, and that might be a risk. As we talked about earlier, the question of whether this will cement or reinforce offline inequalities. So, this didn't quite translate, but that's fine. I think you can follow this. Basically, now I'm going to just start going through some of the findings from our first wave of data, just to give you a little sense of some of the dimensions here. But maybe before I do that, why don't I pause for a moment. I will take a sip of coffee without dropping it. But I don't know if folks have any questions or comments at this point. I know I'm just sort of charging through a lot of stuff, and different people have different levels of familiarity with the work that we've been doing. So why don't I pause for a moment if anyone has a question or comment. Yes?
I have a quick question. I love the concept of participatory politics, but within that, it seems like you could have something that would be much more significant actually showing up to the protest versus using the hashtag. And I'm wondering if in your parlance, have you come up with some sort of subcategories for the way you talk about engagement, the collectivism versus the hitting the pavement kind of action?
So that's a fabulous question. So as you can imagine, you only need sort of 2 academics in the room to get a lot of different versions and visions of all this. So when we had, 8 plus all the research teams, people debated this quite significantly. I wouldn't say we came up with one simple way of thinking about that, but I do think General, and she's just stepped out, but her focus on flash activism is very much wrestling with that, and she's a sociologist of social movement. And so I think a lot of one of the things that she said that I think is so fabulous, she's like, on the way walking over to this meeting, we were talking about it, she's like, on the way walking over to this meeting, I walked by a protest, right? It had no, it's like within the social movements theory, at least within sociology, she feels like people just love protests. They think it's such a big deal. People protest all the time and are ignored. And so she really was pushing people to say, you know, when is a form of protest, be it showing up on pavement or be it, you know, using a Twitter hashtag, when is it consequential? What does it mean to be consequential? Because there's a bunch of different ways in which it could be relevant for the individual, it could be relevant for the community, it could be relevant, obviously, in terms of changing government behavior or corporate activity. And I think, so I do think as a network, we would say that's the key question, not whether it led to face-to-face or did you march, but can you show a connection between these things? And it's certainly one of the things that we know is that very few people show up sort of on the ground to do things. And so part of what she likes about flash activism is this is something people will do. And so is this both an entry point, but also a way for people who don't, for whatever set of reasons, choose to do other forms of activism, can still be active, can still have voice, and can still work to have influence. So, but I do think the big question is this sort of complicated question of what consequence comes from it, which is, I think, there's Jen. See, you stepped out. Sorry. Not at all. But I think, but the first question was very much to your research, which was how we, as a network, think about these questions of the relevance of varied kinds of activism. And I said that we tended as a network to disagree, but we tended to agree that the focus should be on to what degree does the form of activism, whether it's, you know, retweeting something or whether it's going to a face-to-face protest and marching, what are the consequences? And there are multiple kinds of consequences. What are those consequences? So I don't know if that adequately speaks to, I don't know if there's anything else you might want to add to that.
Sounds like I didn't need to be in the room. I apologize, by the way. I came straight from my flight.
No.
Take care of a few things.
Not at
Sorry
all.
to step on.
Not at all. And later, when we're talking a little bit about research, Jen will share a couple minutes, I'm hoping, on what she's working on around this. Yes?
I also wanted to piggyback on that point to ask about when we think about the end game of participatory politics and thinking about how do we quantify kind of the act of showing up, like the word activism, like that was triggering for you. But I think that there's a lot of ways that we think about retweeting as a very passive act, right? But then we think about, for instance, after Charlottesville, the young man, DeAndre Harris, who was really beaten, he ended up raising over $125,000 from activism, right? So like supporting just from people retweeting his You Caring or his like GoFundMe, he's able now to like pay for all of his medical bills and recoup a ton of costs that he's accrued because of the beating that he incurred. So I'm wondering also how do we think about showing up? Yes, obviously very important, like being counted among the number for a particular issue, but also thinking about economic redistribution in the ways that we are now seeing the leveraging of wealth across social groups when we see these kind of like ads or other like services that allow us to kind of not even leave our chair, not leave our home, but like people can donate their birthday to Hurricane Harvey now. So
Right.
people are saying, hey, this is going on in Houston, I'd like to, don't give me a gift, donate to Hurricane Harvey. Or I can create an Amazon list right now for folks who are organizing against the DAPL pipeline situation, right? So I'm wondering how does that factor into the ways that we're thinking about the questions we're asking?
I love your comment because I think it really highlights too, I would still say that you're pushing out, well, so what are the consequences of this? And you're highlighting that there are consequences, but I think you're also highlighting that often when we think of consequences, we're saying, well, did it change a law? Right? The people love voting because it's like, did it change who got elected or did it change a law? And part of what we're saying and what your example is really illustrating clearly is there are lots of consequences besides those two things. And we really want to pay attention to a much broader range. And in part, participatory politics, because it is reflecting the blurred boundaries between our social lives and our political lives is highlighting that there's a lot of stuff that we might think of as being politically significant that is in that space, right? So it is politically significant which films get the Oscars, and it is politically significant, obviously, whether somebody who is injured in a protest gets their medical bills taken care of. Or, obviously, you know, the kind of voluntary civic work of the donations and things like that, and we see that all the time. And we see that frequently going on, building off of cultural connections that people have through popular culture, independent, again, of formal institutions, you know, the Red Cross going out and doing this or that, which is not to say there isn't still a Red Cross, there is, but it's not the only way. Yeah, that's great, yes.
Perhaps this question will be addressed later, so you can go through that.
No, this is good.
I'm curious to hear about the network's work. It seems a primarily U.S.-based team and conceptualization. I've read some of the materials, but
Yeah, it is
by no
primarily.
means, you know, all of it. So I'm curious to hear about thoughts about cross-national work. This ICPSR data, for example, that some of us have worked on.
Yes.
You know, 20, 30 countries in the U.S. isn't included. So,
Right.
you know, comparing the launch, you know, 4-year, 2-week panel in Israel about similar issues and thinking about how to draw on lessons from the survey development work that you did as well. For example, the lessons that you learned between the 2011 and the 2013 wave. Is there sort of project write-up on the lessons that researchers implementing panels in other places might be able to learn from your team's experience?
So we don't have write-ups on that, though we'd be happy to talk with you about that, certainly, and that would make a lot of sense. Jen, yeah?
Although you guys have been in touch, there's a EU project that just got funded last year that will study youth political engagement in 9 European nations. And you guys share your survey instrument with them.
Yes.
And they are actually just about to go into the field and review some of the questions. So there is some potential with that data. I don't know what I'm an external advisor on the project, and I don't know what their timeline for data release is if they haven't gotten it, but eventually there will be at least some measures that are comparable, although not at the same time.
That's a good point. And we have tried to share items in those ways, so that is a good thing to focus on. We, for a bunch of reasons, as you can imagine, wrestled with this question of how do we deal with the fact that the world is much bigger than the U.S. Ethan did do some work, and if you take a look at his work on the website, there is some stuff that speaks to, and certainly his work in general speaks to a much broader international lens. But we did not sort of have the resources. We decided to focus rather than be broader because of the complexities of doing the international work well. And so we haven't collected data, for example, with the exception of Ethan's work. Yeah, those are good points. And anything else at this point? Okay, well, let me share just a couple findings to highlight a sense of some of this. So these lines that aren't really readable say 41% of young people have engaged in at least one act of participatory politics in the prior year. 44% have engaged in one act of institutional politics other than voting. That's what that says. And the last one is they've engaged 40, well, the, yeah, I think that actually should say, I think we have another slide that covers this a little better and will be more readable. But here are a couple other significant findings, and similarly we'll have slides in a moment to cover some of this. The young people of color are more digitally connected in many respects than our white youth. That African American youth in particular report using new media more than others to connect with family and friends, having more followers on Twitter and Facebook, more likely to create media for political means. African Americans and Latinos might be most likely to use new media to learn about and act on political and social issues that affect their lives, and that marginalized young people are now finding new ways through the internet to share their opinions and leverage collective power. These were a bunch of the reasons why we think youth engagement with participatory politics is so significant in relation to political equality, or at least holds open that possibility, and that makes us interested in it. Okay, so let me minimize this.